My mother-in-law stood up in the middle of my wedding dinner, lifted her glass, and called me a gold digger in front of everyone. And what hurt more wasn't her voice, it was the laughter that followed, soft at first, then louder, spreading across the room like it was something normal, something deserved. And I remember turning to my husband, waiting, just waiting for him to say one word, but he didn't. He just sat there, silent, eyes down, like I wasn't even worth defending. And in that moment, something inside me went very still, because they all thought I was trapped there, humiliated, powerless, but they didn't know what I had already done just hours before, and what happened next would change everything. But before I tell you how that night unfolded, if this story truly resonates with you, take a second to like and subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your city, only if this story speaks to your heart, because sometimes the quietest moments carry the biggest turning points. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and that night, my wedding dinner, was the night everything in my life shifted in a way I never expected. But to understand how I stood there smiling while they laughed, you have to go back a few hours earlier to a quiet office on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, where the air felt colder than it should have, and where I signed something that no one in that room at the wedding even imagined existed. Earlier that afternoon, while everyone else was getting ready, hair appointments, makeup artists, champagne with bridesmaids, I was sitting across from a man in a navy suit, a lawyer my father had trusted for years. His office smelled faintly of paper and coffee, and the city outside the window looked distant, like I was already stepping out of my own life. He slid a folder toward me, slow, careful, like he understood the weight of what was inside. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at it for a second, my fingers resting on the edge of the table, and he said quietly, "Once you sign this, everything changes. There's no going back." And I nodded, because I already knew that. I had known it for weeks, ever since the first time Margaret looked at me like I didn't belong, like I was something temporary in her son's life. I met Daniel 2 years ago, and for a while things felt simple. He was kind, attentive, the kind of man who remembered small details, how I took my coffee, the way I liked quiet weekends instead of crowded places, and I believed that meant something. I believed it meant I mattered to him. But his family, they were different. They came from money, old money, the kind that doesn't need to be explained, the kind that shows in the way people sit, the way they talk, the way they look at you when they think you don't belong. And from the very beginning, I could feel it, the distance, the quiet judgment. Margaret never said anything openly at first, but there were small things, the way she would pause before introducing me to someone, the way she would correct little details about me that didn't need correcting, like she was rewriting who I was in front of others. And Daniel, he always told me to ignore it. "They'll come around," he said. "Just give them time." And I wanted to believe him, so I did. I adjusted, I smiled more, I spoke less. I chose my words carefully at dinners. I made myself smaller in rooms where I felt out of place. And for a while, it seemed like things were improving, or maybe I just got better at pretending they were. But then, about a month before the wedding, something changed. Margaret stopped pretending. It wasn't subtle anymore. One evening at dinner, she leaned back in her chair, looked directly at me, and said, "You must feel very lucky." And I asked her what she meant, and she smiled. But it didn't reach her eyes. "Lucky to marry into this family," she said. And the table went quiet for a second, just a second, before someone changed the subject. And Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, like that was enough, like that fixed it, but it didn't. And that was the moment I started to see things differently. Not just her, but him too, because silence, I realized, can say more than words. And from that night on, I started paying attention to what was said, to what wasn't said, to the way people looked at me when they thought I wasn't watching. And what I saw wasn't a family slowly accepting me. It was a family tolerating me, waiting, watching, judging. And somewhere in that quiet observation, I made a decision. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a small shift in the way I thought. A question that kept repeating in my mind. What if they were right about one thing? What if I didn't belong here, but not for the reasons they believed? What if I was never meant to stay in the role they had already decided for me? And that question led me to that office, to that folder, to the pen that felt heavier than it should have in my hand. I finally opened the documents. pages filled with terms, ownership structures, signatures waiting to be completed, and I didn't rush. I read carefully, line by line, because this wasn't just paperwork, it was a line being drawn, and when I signed my name at the bottom, slowly, deliberately, I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not fear, something quieter, something steadier. Like I had just stepped into a version of myself they had never seen before. And the lawyer nodded once, almost respectfully, and said, "It's done?" And I closed the folder, stood up, and looked out at the city again. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like I was waiting for approval. I just felt certain. And a few hours later, I stood in that wedding hall, lights soft, music playing, glasses clinking, surrounded by people who thought they understood exactly who I was, and then Margaret raised her glass, and everything changed. I did not move when she said it, not right away, because the sound of her voice seemed to settle into the room like something heavy, something permanent, and for a second, all I could hear was the faint clink of silverware and the low hum of conversations that had suddenly gone quiet. Then someone laughed, just one person at first, a short, awkward laugh, but it did not stay awkward for long. It spread, light and careless, and I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me, measuring, judging, confirming something they had already decided about me long before this night. I kept my posture straight, my shoulders relaxed, the way I had practiced in mirrors before events like this, the way you learn to hold yourself when you know people are watching for the smallest crack. And I slowly turned my head toward Margaret. She was still standing, her glass raised slightly, her lips curved in a polite smile that did not match her words, as if she had just made a harmless joke instead of tearing something open in front of everyone. I noticed the details, the way her fingers held the stem of the glass, steady, confident, the way she did not look at me directly anymore, but at the guests around her, inviting them into the moment, making it shared, making it acceptable. And then I looked at Daniel, because that mattered more than anything she could say. I gave him a second, maybe two, enough time for him to look up, to meet my eyes, to say something simple like "that is not true," or "that is enough." But he did not. His gaze stayed on the table, on nothing in particular, his jaw slightly tense, like he was waiting for it to pass, waiting for the moment to move on without him having to choose a side. And something in my chest tightened, not sharply, not dramatically, just a quiet pressure, like a door closing slowly. I did not feel surprised, not really, because this was not the first time he had chosen silence. It was just the first time he had done it in front of everyone, the first time it had been this clear, this visible. I heard someone at the far end of the table whisper something about timing, about how bold it was to say that at a wedding, and another voice responded that sometimes truth comes out at the worst moments. And I almost smiled at that, because they thought this was truth. They thought they were witnessing something being exposed, not realizing they were the ones being revealed. I shifted my weight slightly, the fabric of my dress brushing softly against my legs, grounding me, reminding me where I was, reminding me that this moment, as sharp as it felt, was still just a moment, and I reached for my glass, my fingers wrapping around it carefully, not too tight, just enough to steady my hands. I took a small sip, letting the silence stretch a little longer, because silence has a way of making people uncomfortable when they expect a reaction, and Margaret noticed it. I could see it in the slight tilt of her head, in the way her smile tightened just a fraction, as if she had expected me to respond differently, to defend myself, to show emotion, to give her something she could push against, but I did not. I just stood there, calm, composed, and that seemed to shift the energy in the room in a subtle way. The laughter softened, conversations hesitated, and for a brief second, it felt like the room was waiting, not for her, but for me. And that was when she spoke again, adding just one more sentence, something about how some people know exactly what they are doing when they choose who to marry. And there it was, the confirmation, the line she wanted everyone to remember, the label she wanted attached to me. And I felt that quiet pressure in my chest settle into something steadier, something clearer, because this was the moment, not because of what she said, but because of what it revealed. Not about me, but about them, about how far they were willing to go. about how comfortable they were, making me smaller in front of others, and more importantly, about how little Daniel was willing to do about it. I lowered my glass slowly, placing it back on the table with a soft, controlled movement, the sound barely noticeable, but it felt loud to me, like a marker, like a line being drawn between who I had been walking into this room and who I was about to become. I glanced around the table, meeting a few eyes briefly, some curious, some amused, some uncomfortable, and then I looked back at Margaret, really looked at her this time, not as someone I needed approval from, not as someone I needed to impress, but simply as a person who had just shown me exactly where I stood in her world, and I realized something in that moment, something simple and almost obvious. I did not need to convince her of anything. I did not need to defend myself in a room where the narrative had already been decided, because the truth was not something I needed to argue for. It was something that was already set in motion, hours before this dinner, in a quiet office, with a pen and a decision that none of them had seen coming. My heart was still beating faster than usual. I could feel it in my chest, in my throat, but my voice, when I finally chose to use it, would not carry that urgency. It would not carry the pressure of the moment. It would carry something else, something much quieter, something much harder to dismiss. And as the room waited, as the last few murmurs faded, I felt that certainty again, the same one I had felt standing in front of that window earlier that afternoon, looking out at the city, knowing that I was no longer stepping into their expectations. I was stepping out of them, and they had no idea. Not yet, but they were about to, and the realization of that, the weight of what was about to unfold, settled into me like calm, like control, like the quiet before something irreversible begins. I let the silence stretch just a second longer, long enough for the last few whispers to fade and for every eye in that room to settle on me. And then I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just steady, calm, the kind of voice that makes people lean in without realizing it. I said, "Margaret, you might be right about one thing." And I paused, not for effect, but because I wanted to choose my next words carefully, because words matter when they are the only thing holding a room together. I set my hand lightly on the edge of the table, grounding myself, and continued. I did make a decision when I chose to marry into this family, and I saw the faint shift in her expression, the expectation that I was about to defend myself, to explain, to justify. But I did not do any of that. Instead, I reached into my bag, slowly, deliberately, feeling the smooth edge of the folder inside, the same folder I had closed just hours earlier in that quiet office, and I placed it gently on the table in front of me, the soft sound of paper against wood cutting through the room more clearly than any raised voice could have. I did not open it yet. I just let it sit there, visibly present, something unexpected in a moment that had felt predictable to everyone else. I glanced at Daniel again, just briefly, and this time he looked up, confusion crossing his face, his brows pulling together slightly, as if he was trying to understand what I was doing. And for the first time that night, he actually looked at me, not past me, not through me, but at me, and I held his gaze for a second before looking away, because this was not about him anymore. Not really. This was about something larger, something that had already been decided. I opened the folder slowly, the paper sliding softly as I turned it toward the center of the table, not pushing it, not presenting it dramatically, just placing it where it could be seen. And I said quietly, "I signed these earlier today," and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The room seemed to hesitate, like it had missed a step and did not know how to recover. Margaret lowered her glass slightly, her smile fading just enough to reveal something underneath it, not fear yet, but uncertainty. And she leaned forward just a fraction, her eyes flicking down to the documents and then back up to me. "What is that supposed to be?" she asked. Her tone still controlled, still polite, but there was a thin edge to it now, something sharper. I did not answer right away. Instead, I turned one of the pages, letting the sound of it fill the space. And then I said, "It is the final transfer agreement, the one your family lawyers drafted last month, the one Daniel asked me to review before the wedding." And I saw Daniel's expression change, quickly, almost imperceptibly, but it was there, a flicker of recognition, followed by something else. "Something closer to concern, Emily. "What are you talking about?" he said. His voice low, cautious, like he was trying not to draw more attention, but it was too late for that. Everyone was already watching, listening, waiting. I met his eyes again, and this time I did not look away. "You remember," I said softly. "You told me it was just a formality, just a way to keep everything organized after the marriage." And he did not respond right away. His lips pressed together, his shoulders tensing slightly, and I knew in that moment that he understood, at least partially, what I was saying, but he did not yet understand the full weight of it, because he had never expected me to read every line, to ask questions, to follow through on every clause. I turned another page and placed my finger lightly on a paragraph near the bottom, the ink still dark, still fresh, and I said, "I made a few adjustments before signing, nothing outside the legal framework. Just clarifications?" And the word hung in the air, simple, almost harmless. But it shifted something in the room. I could feel it. The way people leaned in slightly, the way the energy tightened. Margaret's eyes narrowed just a fraction, and she stepped closer to the table, her attention fully on the documents now, and I could see it, the moment her confidence started to slip, just a little, because this was no longer a social moment, no longer something she could control with tone and posture and well-placed words. This had moved into something else, something structured, something binding, and she knew that world well enough to recognize the difference. "You should explain what you mean," she said, her voice steadier now, more direct, and I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. I traced the line of text with my finger, slow, deliberate, and said, "The assets listed here, the properties, the accounts, the holdings under Daniel's name, they were all included in this agreement, and as I signed, they were legally reassigned, transferred under a new structure, one that places full control under my name." And I let the sentence settle, not rushing to fill the silence that followed, because silence was doing the work for me now. I heard someone inhale sharply, another person shifting in their chair, the faint scrape of wood against the floor, and Daniel stepped back slightly, like he needed space to process what he had just heard. "That is not possible," he said. But his voice did not carry certainty. It carried doubt, and I looked at him calmly. "It is," I said. "You just never thought I would actually do it." And that was the truth, not spoken with anger, not with accusation, just stated, simple, clear. And Margaret reached for the papers then, her hand moving faster than before, her composure cracking just enough to reveal urgency, and as her fingers touched the edge of the document, I leaned back slightly, giving her space, because this was the moment they were about to see for themselves what I had already known hours ago. And as her eyes moved across the page, reading, verifying, understanding, I felt that same quiet certainty settle in again, deeper this time, heavier, because this was no longer just a decision I had made in a quiet office. This was a reality unfolding in front of them, piece by piece, line by line, and there was nothing they could do to stop it now. Margaret's fingers tightened around the edges of the document as her eyes moved faster across the page, and I watched the exact moment her confidence broke. It was small, almost invisible, just a slight pause between lines, a subtle change in her breathing, but it was there, and I knew she had reached the part that mattered. She flipped the page quickly, too quickly, like she was trying to disprove what she had just read, but every line confirmed the same thing, and the room stayed quiet. Not the casual quiet from before, not the kind filled with background chatter, but a heavy, focused silence, the kind that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. Daniel stepped closer now, his chair scraping softly against the floor, his hand reaching toward the papers, but stopping just short, like he was unsure if touching them would make it more real. "Emily," he said again, but this time my name sounded different in his voice, not dismissive, not distant, but uncertain, and I could hear something else underneath it, something like concern, like he was starting to understand that this was not something he could smooth over or ignore. I did not rush to explain. I let them sit with it, because understanding takes time, especially when it challenges something you have always assumed was fixed. Margaret finally looked up at me, her expression no longer polite, no longer composed, but controlled in a different way now, tighter, sharper. She placed the document back on the table with more force than necessary and said, "This is not valid. her voice steady but lower, like she was trying to contain something rising beneath it. "You cannot just transfer assets like this, without proper authorization." And I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of the process she was referring to. "That is why it was done through your own legal team," I said calmly. "The same firm that drafted the original agreement, the same advisors you trust. I worked with them directly, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something close to disbelief cross her face, because that was the part she had not expected. Not the paperwork itself, but the fact that it had been done within her own system, within the structure she believed she controlled. Daniel finally picked up the document, his eyes scanning the pages quickly, then slowing, then stopping altogether, his posture stiffening as he read more carefully, line by line, his lips parting slightly like he was about to speak, but no words came out, and I could almost hear his thoughts trying to catch up, trying to retrace steps, to find the moment where this could have been stopped. But there was no such moment. "Not anymore. You said this was a formality," I reminded him quietly. "You said it was just to organize things after the wedding." And he shook his head slightly, still looking at the page, like he was hoping the words would change if he read them again. "I did not think you would," he started, then stopped, because he did not know how to finish that sentence. And I did not help him, because the truth was already there. He had not thought I would read it. He had not thought I would question it. He had not thought I would act on it. And that assumption was what had made all of this possible. Someone at the table cleared their throat. Another shifted in their seat. And I could feel the attention in the room shift again, not toward me as the subject of humiliation, but toward the unfolding reality in front of them. Margaret stepped closer, her hand resting on the table now, her posture leaning forward slightly, and she said, "Even if this was signed, there are still procedures, reviews, approvals. This does not mean what you think it means." And I met her gaze steadily. "It means exactly what is written," I said. "Every clause was reviewed. Every transfer was executed under the terms your team provided. Nothing was rushed, nothing was overlooked, and the firmness in my voice was not loud, but it was clear. It left no space for reinterpretation." Daniel finally lowered the document, his face pale, his eyes moving between me and the papers like he was trying to reconcile two different versions of reality. "Why would you do this?" he asked. And the question hung in the air, simple, direct, but layered with everything he had not said earlier, everything he had chosen not to see. I held his gaze for a moment before answering, because I needed to understand where I stood. I said quietly, and I let that answer settle, because it was true, not the full truth, but enough. Enough for him to feel the weight of it. Enough for him to realize that this was not about money. Not really. It was about position, about value, about the difference between being included and being tolerated. Margaret let out a short breath, almost a scoff, but it lacked the confidence it had before. "This is not how things work," she said, and I noticed the way her fingers tapped lightly against the table, a small, restless movement that had not been there earlier. And I understood that what unsettled her was not just the documents, it was the loss of control, the shift from a social situation she could dominate to a structured reality she could not easily reshape. I reached forward then, not to take the papers back, but to turn one page slightly, guiding her attention to a specific section. "Right here," I said, "the final authorization," and she followed the motion despite herself, her eyes dropping to the signature at the bottom, the one that made everything irreversible. And for a second, no one spoke, no one moved. The weight of that signature sitting between us, like something solid, something undeniable, and I leaned back again, my hands resting lightly at my sides, my breathing steady, my posture relaxed, not defensive, not aggressive, just present, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove. The documents spoke for themselves, and as the room absorbed that, as each person processed what had just been revealed, I felt something shift completely, not in them, but in me, something final, something that had been building quietly for a long time, and now, standing there in that silence, I realized that whatever happened next, whatever they said, whatever they tried to do, it would not change what had already been set in motion. And for the first time that night, I was not reacting to them. I was simply watching. No one spoke for a few seconds after that. And it was not the kind of silence you can ignore or move past. It was heavy, like the room itself was holding something in place, And I could feel every person there trying to understand what had just happened, trying to recalculate everything they thought they knew about me, about this marriage, about the balance of power they had assumed was fixed. Daniel was still holding the document, but his grip had loosened, his fingers no longer firm around the edges, as if the paper itself had become something unfamiliar to him, something that no longer belonged to the world he understood. He looked down again, slower this time, reading more carefully, and I could see it in his face, the realization spreading in stages, first confusion, then disbelief, then something heavier, something closer to regret, and he swallowed before speaking, his voice quieter now, almost careful. "Emily, we need to talk about this," and I tilted my head slightly, not dismissing him, but not moving toward him either, because this was not a private conversation anymore, not after what had just happened, not after the way he had chosen silence when it mattered most. I kept my tone even when I answered, "We are talking," I said, and a few people at the table shifted in their seats, the sound of fabric and chairs breaking the stillness just enough to remind everyone they were still part of this moment. Margaret exhaled slowly, and her posture straightening again as she tried to regain control, but it was different now. The confidence she had earlier was no longer effortless, it was forced, constructed, and I could see the small cracks in it, the way her hand hovered near the papers but did not touch them again, the way her eyes moved between me and Daniel, as if searching for a point of stability that no longer existed. "This does not change anything about this family," she said finally, her voice firm, but there was a strain in it now, a tightness that had not been there before, and I met her gaze without hesitation. "It changes everything that matters," I replied, not sharply, just clearly, because the truth did not need emphasis, it only needed to be stated. Someone at the far end of the table spoke up then, a relative I barely knew, asking in a low voice what exactly had been transferred, and Daniel did not answer. He just handed the document across the table, his movements slower than before, like each action required more effort now. And as the paper moved from one set of hands to another, I watched the reactions ripple outward, one person reading, then another leaning in, then a quiet exchange of looks that said more than words could. And I noticed how quickly the atmosphere shifted, the earlier laughter now replaced by something cautious, something uncertain, like people were reassessing not just me, but their own positions in relation to what had just been revealed. Margaret stepped back slightly, creating distance between herself and the table, and for a moment she did not speak, which told me more than anything she could have said, because she was someone who always filled silence, always controlled the flow of conversation, and now she was choosing not to, or perhaps she simply could not. Daniel finally looked at me again, really looked this time, not with confusion, but with a kind of urgency, like he was trying to find a way back to something that no longer existed. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked, and there was something in his voice I had not heard before, not authority, not certainty, but vulnerability. And I held that moment for a second before answering, because I needed to. I needed to understand exactly what I was feeling before I put it into words. "I told you everything you needed to know," I said. "You just did not think it mattered." And he flinched slightly, not dramatically, just enough to show that the words had landed, that they had found their place. And I did not press further, because I did not need to. The room was already doing that for me. Every glance, every shift, every quiet exchange reinforcing what had just been set in motion. Margaret shook her head slowly, as if rejecting the entire situation. "This is not over," she said. And there was a different tone in her voice now, less about control, more about resistance, about refusal to accept the new reality. And I nodded once, because in a way, she was right. It was not over, but it was no longer in her hands, or Daniel's, or anyone else at that table. It had moved beyond that, bull innerode, into something structured, something finalized, something that would not change because of what was said in this room. The music in the background had stopped at some point, I realized, or maybe it had just faded into something so quiet it no longer registered, and the lights, still warm and soft, now felt almost too bright, like they were exposing everything that had been hidden beneath the surface. I took a slow breath, steady, controlled, and looked around the table one more time, not searching for approval, not waiting for a reaction, just observing, taking in the shift that had happened, the reversal that no one had anticipated, and then I turned back to Margaret, meeting her eyes directly. Not with hostility, not with anger, just with clarity. And in that moment, I understood something that had been building quietly for a long time, something I had not fully recognized until now. This was never about proving them wrong. It was about no longer needing them to be right. And that realization settled into me, with a calm that felt stronger than anything I had felt earlier that night, because it meant I was no longer reacting to their version of me. I was standing in my own, and whatever came next, whatever they tried to say or do, would not change that. The shift in the room did not happen all at once. It moved slowly, like something settling after being shaken, and I could see it in the way people no longer looked at me with quiet judgment, but with careful attention, like they were recalculating everything they had assumed just minutes ago. Daniel set the papers down on the table, not with authority, not with confidence, but with hesitation, and he ran a hand through his hair, a small gesture I had seen many times before when he felt out of control. "Emily, we can fix this," he said, his voice lower now, almost controlled in a way that felt unfamiliar, and I noticed how quickly he had shifted from silence to urgency, from distance to involvement. But I did not move toward him. I stayed where I was, because this was not something to fix, not anymore. "There is nothing to fix," I said quietly. And I saw the way those words landed, not as resistance, but as finality. Margaret stepped forward again, her presence sharper now, more direct. She was not retreating, she was recalibrating. People like her do not step back easily. They look for new angles, new leverage. "You are overestimating what those papers mean," she said, her tone measured but firm. "Legal structures can be challenged, agreements can be reviewed. This is not as simple as you are making it sound." And I nodded slightly, because she was not entirely wrong. There are always processes, always complexities. But what she did not understand was that I had already accounted for that. I had not rushed into this, I had not signed something blindly, I had taken the time, asked the questions, followed every step to its conclusion. "I understand the process," I said calmly. "That is why everything was completed before tonight, fully executed, fully registered. There is nothing pending," and the certainty in my voice seemed to settle over the room again. Not loudly, but firmly. Daniel looked between us, his expression tightening. "Why would you do this today?" he asked, and this time his voice carried something else, something closer to frustration, not anger, but the realization that timing matters, that this was not accidental. I held his gaze for a moment before answering, "Because today was the first day it mattered," I said, and I let that sit, because it was the truth, not just about the documents, but about everything. About the way things had been building, the way small moments had led to this one, the way silence had shaped decisions more than words ever could. One of the older relatives cleared his throat again, asking quietly if this meant the business accounts were included, and Daniel did not answer. He just looked back down at the document, flipping through the pages more carefully now, and I could see him recognizing the scope of it, not just the properties, not just the visible assets, but the structure itself, the control, the authority, the decision-making power that had shifted without him realizing it. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly, and she stepped closer to him, her hand brushing the edge of the paper as if she wanted to take it back but could not bring herself to do it. "You should not have signed anything without consulting me," she said to him, her voice low but firm, and that was the first time she directed something toward him instead of me, and I noticed it immediately, because it meant the dynamic had changed. The control she had assumed was no longer intact. Daniel did not respond right away, which in itself was an answer, and I could see the tension building between them, not loud, not dramatic, but present, like something that had always been there but had never been exposed like this. I reached for my glass again, taking a small sip, not because I needed it, but because it gave me a moment to observe, to take in the way the room was shifting, the way people were leaning back now instead of forward, the way the earlier energy had softened into something more cautious, more uncertain. Someone near the end of the table whispered that this was not what they expected from a wedding dinner. And I almost smiled at that, because neither had I, not exactly, but I had expected something. I had known that this moment would come in some form, maybe not this exact shape, maybe not these exact words. but I had felt it building. And that was why I had acted before stepping into this room. Daniel finally looked up again, his eyes meeting mine with something new in them, something I could not ignore. It was not just confusion anymore, it was awareness, the kind that comes too late, the kind that makes you replay moments in your head, searching for where things changed. "Emily," he said again, softer this time, like he was trying to reach me in a different way. And for a brief second, I saw the version of him I had once believed in, the one who had made promises, the one who had said things would be different. But that version felt distant now, like something from another time, and I did not move toward it, because I understood something clearly in that moment. This was not about what he felt now, it was about what he had not done before, and that difference mattered more than anything he could say now. Margaret straightened her posture again, drawing in a slow breath, as if preparing to regain control of the situation. "We will review this properly," she said, her tone regaining some of its earlier firmness. "This is not something that will stand without scrutiny," and I met her gaze steadily. "You can review anything you want," I said, "but it will not change what has already been finalized," and I could see it then, the exact moment she understood that this was not a social game anymore, not something she could influence with presence or authority. This was something fixed, something structured, something that existed outside of her control, and that realization settled over her like a shadow, not dramatic, not visible to everyone, but clear enough if you knew what to look for. The room remained quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not tension waiting to break, but tension that had already shifted into something else, something resolved, something that would not go back to what it was before. And as I stood there, steady, composed, watching them process it, I realized that the moment I had anticipated, the one I had prepared for in that quiet office hours earlier, had already happened, not when I spoke, not when I placed the documents on the table, but when they realized they could not undo it. And that realization changed everything. The room did not return to normal after that. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted, not just on paper, but in the way people were now looking at me, and I noticed it in the smallest details. The way a woman across the table lowered her glass more carefully than before, the way someone who had laughed earlier now avoided eye contact, the way the conversations that tried to restart felt forced, like they were stepping around something no one wanted to acknowledge directly. Daniel was still standing near the table, but he no longer looked like the center of anything. His presence had changed, diminished in a way that was not loud but was unmistakable. He glanced toward me again, then toward his mother, as if searching for direction. But Margaret did not give him any. She remained still, her posture upright, her expression composed again on the surface. But there was a sharpness in her eyes now, something calculating, something that told me she was already thinking ahead, already trying to find the next move. People like her do not accept loss easily. They adjust, they reposition, they look for ways to regain ground, and I knew that this moment, as final as it felt, was only one part of a larger shift. "Emily," she said after a few seconds, her voice controlled, measured. "We should continue this conversation in private," and there it was, the attempt to move the scene away from the public space, away from witnesses, away from the context that had made it powerful. And I understood exactly why she wanted that, because power changes when it is observed, because what had just happened did not just exist between us, it existed in the memory of everyone in that room, and that made it harder to reshape, harder to deny. I shook my head slightly, not dismissive, just clear. "There is nothing left to clarify privately," I said. "Everything that needed to be said has already been said," and I saw the reaction ripple again, subtle but present, because refusing that invitation meant holding the moment where it was, not allowing it to be softened or reframed behind closed doors. Daniel took a step closer to me then, lowering his voice, almost pleading now. "Emily, please, this is not the place." And I looked at him, really looked this time, taking in the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered uncertainly at his side, like he wanted to reach out but did not know if he had the right to, and I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not even disappointment anymore, something quieter, something that felt like distance. "This became the place the moment you chose not to speak earlier," I said softly, and he stopped, just stopped, like the words had taken something out of him, and I did not say anything else, because I did not need to. The truth was already there, clear and unavoidable. Someone at the table finally spoke up, attempting to lighten the situation. suggesting that perhaps it was time for a toast, for something celebratory, but the suggestion fell flat. No one moved, no one lifted their glass, because the atmosphere had changed too much, the context had shifted beyond recovery. Margaret exhaled slowly, her fingers pressing lightly against the table as if grounding herself, and she said, "Very well, if this is how you want to handle it, then we will proceed accordingly." And her tone had changed again, not the earlier confidence, not the defensive edge from before, but something colder, more deliberate, like she was stepping into a different role now, one that was less about immediate control and more about long-term strategy. And I recognized that. I understood that this was not the end of her response. It was the beginning of a different kind of engagement, and I was prepared for that. Because I had not made this decision lightly, I had considered the consequences, not just for tonight, but for everything that would follow. Daniel looked between us again, his expression tight, conflicted, like he was caught between two realities that no longer aligned. And I could see the weight of that settling on him, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a quiet, heavy way that changed how he carried himself. I picked up the folder again, closing it carefully, not in a rush, just a simple, controlled movement, and I held it at my side, not as a statement, not as a threat, but as something that was already done, already complete. The room remained still, but it was no longer tense in the same way. It was settled, like something had been decided, like a line had been drawn and everyone present understood it, even if they did not fully grasp the implications yet. I took a slow breath, steady, and let my gaze move across the room one last time. Not searching for approval, not waiting for reaction, just acknowledging the shift that had taken place, the reversal that had unfolded quietly but completely. And then I turned back toward the table, my posture relaxed, my expression calm, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to argue. The moment had already happened, the change had already been set, and whatever came next would not undo what had been revealed here tonight, it would only build on it. And as I stood there, surrounded by people who had once looked at me as if I did not belong, I realized that for the first time, I was not standing in their expectations at all. I was standing outside of them, and that made all the difference. No one stopped me when I stepped away from the table, and that was the first thing I noticed. Not the silence, not the looks, but the absence of resistance. Earlier that night, every movement I made had felt watched, measured, quietly judged, but now there was space. Actual space around me, like something invisible had shifted, and people did not know how to close that gap anymore. I walked slowly, not rushing, not trying to leave dramatically, just moving with the same steady pace I had held all evening, the soft sound of my heels against the polished floor grounding me with each step, and I could feel eyes following me, not with the same dismissive curiosity as before, but with something else, something more careful, more aware, like they were trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Behind me, I heard Daniel call my name, not loudly, but clearly enough to reach me, and I paused, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to choose whether to turn around, and after a second, I did, slowly, meeting his eyes across the distance that now felt much larger than a few feet. He took a step toward me, then another, stopping just close enough that his voice would not carry to the entire room. "Emily, please do not walk away like this," he said. And there was something different in his tone now, something softer, something almost unfamiliar, like he was trying to reach a version of me that had already moved on. I held his gaze, calm, steady, and I said, "I am not walking away. I am just not standing in the same place anymore." And he frowned slightly, as if trying to process what that meant, his hand lifting halfway before dropping again, uncertain. "We can fix this," he repeated, but the words sounded weaker this time, like he was repeating something he had always believed without fully understanding it, and I shook my head gently, not dismissing him, just correcting something that had been misunderstood for too long. "This is not something that broke tonight," I said quietly. "This is something that was already broken." And he went still, completely still, like the weight of that realization had finally settled in a way he could not ignore. Behind him, I could see Margaret watching us, her expression controlled again, but her eyes sharp, focused, calculating every word, every movement, like she was memorizing it, storing it, preparing for whatever came next. and I knew she would not forget this moment. Not the way the room had shifted, not the way control had slipped from her in front of witnesses, but I also knew that what mattered now was not what she would do later, it was what I chose to do next. Daniel took a breath, slower this time, like he was trying to steady himself. "You should have trusted me," he said, and I felt something almost like a pause inside me. Not hesitation, but recognition, because trust had been the foundation of everything I had believed in at the beginning, and hearing that word now felt different, heavier, like something that had been used too easily before. "I did trust you," I replied, and my voice stayed even, calm. But there was a clarity in it that had not been there before. "I trusted you to speak when it mattered, and you did not." And he looked down for a second, his jaw tightening, because there was no argument for that, no explanation that could change what had already happened. And that was the difference now. Before, we might have talked around it, softened it, explained it away, but tonight had removed that possibility. Someone behind him shifted, a chair moving slightly, a glass being set down a little too hard, and the sound echoed more than it should have in the quiet room, and I realized that people were still watching, still listening, even if they were pretending not to, and that made everything more real, more defined. Margaret stepped forward then, her presence returning to the space between us, not interrupting, but inserting herself back into the dynamic. "This conversation is not finished," she said, her tone controlled but firm, and I met her gaze again, steady, unshaken. "You are right," I said. "It is not finished, but it is no longer the same conversation," and that seemed to register with her in a way that nothing else had, because it acknowledged what she already knew, that the ground had shifted, that whatever came next would not follow the same rules she had relied on before. Daniel looked between us again, his expression tight, conflicted, like he was trying to find a place to stand that no longer existed, and I could see it in the way his shoulders held tension, in the way his posture had changed from earlier in the night, less certain, less grounded, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of something I could not fully name. Not sympathy, not regret, just an awareness of how quickly things can change when something fundamental is revealed. I adjusted my grip on the folder slightly, the weight of it steady in my hand, and I realized that this was the first time all evening that I felt completely in control of my own position, not reacting, not adjusting, just choosing, and that realization settled into me with a quiet strength, not loud, not dramatic, just present. I glanced once more at the table, at the people who had been laughing earlier, at the empty glasses, the untouched plates, the decorations that now felt out of place in a moment that had outgrown them, and then I looked back at Daniel, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to wait for him to say something, to fix something, to explain something. I simply said, "I think we both know this night changed everything," and I let that stand on its own, because it did not need anything more, and as the silence returned, deeper now, more settled, I understood that whatever came next would not be about proving anything to them, it would be about living with the truth that had just been revealed, and I was ready for that in a way I had not been before. For a moment, no one moved after I said that, and it felt like the entire room had accepted something without saying it out loud, like an unspoken agreement had formed that nothing about this night could go back to what it was supposed to be. Daniel stood there in front of me, his shoulders slightly lowered now, not in defeat exactly, but in a kind of quiet realization that whatever he said next would not restore what had already shifted, and I could see it in his eyes, the way he was no longer trying to control the situation, but trying to understand it, trying to catch up to something that had already moved past him. "Emily," he said again, softer this time, almost careful, like he was stepping into unfamiliar ground, "we do not have to do this here. We can talk later, we can figure this out together." And I listened to him without interrupting, not because I was considering his words, but because I wanted to hear the difference in them, the change in tone, the way urgency had replaced confidence. And I realized something as he spoke. This was the first time he was actually speaking to me in a way that acknowledged my position, not as someone who needed to adjust, but as someone who had already acted, and that shift, as small as it seemed, came too late. I shook my head slightly. Not rejecting him, just correcting the idea behind his words. "There is nothing left to figure out," I said quietly, and I kept my voice steady, not raised, not emotional, just clear, because the truth did not need volume. It only needed to be present. Behind him, I noticed the way people had started to move again. Small movements at first, someone picking up a glass, someone adjusting their seat, like the room was trying to reassemble itself after being disrupted. But it did not feel natural. It felt forced, like everyone was aware that something irreversible had already happened. Margaret took another step forward, closing the distance slightly. Her expression composed again, but her eyes sharper now, more focused, as if she had shifted from reacting to calculating. "This is not the end of anything," she said, her voice controlled, almost measured. "You may think you have control now, but structures like this can be challenged, reversed, reinterpreted." And I met her gaze without hesitation, because I had expected this, not the exact words, but the direction of them, the attempt to regain ground, to introduce doubt, to reframe the situation as something temporary. "I understand what you are saying," I replied calmly, but this was not done carelessly. Every step was reviewed, every clause was confirmed. There is no ambiguity here, and I saw the smallest shift in her expression, not defeat, not yet, but recognition, the understanding that this was not something she could easily dismiss or dismantle. Daniel looked between us again, his expression tightening, and for a moment it felt like he was about to say something stronger, something more decisive. But instead he exhaled slowly, like the weight of the situation had settled into him fully, and he said, "I should have paid more attention." And the honesty in that sentence, simple as it was, hung in the air differently than anything else he had said that night, because it was not a defense, not an excuse, just a recognition. And I felt a brief pause inside me when I heard it, not because it changed anything, but because it confirmed something I had already known, that this was not just about intention, it was about action, about what is done when it matters, not what is said after. I nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because there was nothing else to add to that. Someone near the end of the table stood up quietly, as if unsure whether it was appropriate to remain seated, and that small movement seemed to signal something to the rest of the room. A shift from passive observation to quiet disengagement. People began to gather their things slowly, not leaving abruptly, but no longer anchored to the moment, like they understood that whatever had just happened was no longer theirs to witness. Margaret noticed it too. I could see it in the way her posture adjusted slightly, the way her attention flickered briefly toward the movement around us, and then back to me, as if she was recalculating not just the situation, but the audience, the context, the impact. Daniel took a step back then, creating a small distance between us, and I recognized it for what it was, not rejection, but space, the kind that comes when someone realizes they no longer know where they stand. And for the first time that night, I did not feel the need to close that distance, to bridge it, to fix it. I simply let it be. I adjusted the folder in my hand again, the weight of it steady, familiar, and I realized that it was no longer just a set of documents. It was a marker, a line that separated what had been from what would come next. Margaret spoke again, quieter this time, almost to herself, but still loud enough to be heard. "This will not be the last conversation we have." And I looked at her, steady, calm, and I said, "I know," and that was all. Because anything more would have been unnecessary. The truth was already clear. This was not an ending in the way she meant it. It was a beginning, just not the kind she had planned for. Daniel looked at me one last time, his expression still unsettled, still searching, and I held his gaze for a second before looking away, not out of avoidance, but because I no longer needed to stay in that moment. I turned slightly, not rushing, not hesitating, just choosing to move forward. And as I took that first step away from him, from the table, from the version of the night that had been expected, I felt something settle inside me, something steady, something clear, like a decision that had finally reached its natural conclusion. And behind me, the room continued to shift, voices returning in low tones, movements becoming more frequent, but none of it pulled me back, because I understood now completely that what had happened here was not something that needed to be revisited. It was something that had already defined the path ahead. The air outside felt different the moment I stepped out of the reception hall, not colder, not warmer, just quieter, like the noise from inside had been sealed behind a door that I did not intend to open again. I slowed my pace slightly as I reached the edge of the building, the soft evening light reflecting off the glass walls around me, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to stop completely, just for a second, just long enough to feel the stillness without interruption. My hand tightened slightly around the folder I was holding, not out of tension, but out of awareness, because everything inside it had already changed the course of what came next. I could still hear faint voices from inside, muffled, indistinct, like something distant that no longer belonged to me, and I realized that the separation had already happened, not when I walked out, but when I chose not to stay in that moment any longer. A few seconds later, the door behind me opened, and I did not need to turn to know who it was. I could feel the shift in the air, the hesitation in the footsteps, the pause before speaking. "Emily," Daniel said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the certainty it had carried earlier in the night, and I turned slowly, meeting his eyes again. But this time the distance between us felt clearer, not just physical, but something deeper, something that had been building long before tonight. He stepped closer, stopping a few feet away, like he was unsure how close he was allowed to come. "I did not follow you to argue," he said, and I believed him, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. There was no sharpness, no attempt to control the conversation, just a careful tone, like he was trying not to break something further. I nodded slightly, acknowledging his words without inviting more than that. "Then why did you come?" I asked, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction. "Because I did not want you to leave like that," he said, and I held his gaze for a moment, considering the meaning behind that, not the words themselves, but the timing of them, and I realized something simple, something that no longer needed to be complicated. "I did not leave like that," I said quietly. "I left after everything was already clear." And he looked at me, really looked this time, like he was trying to see something he had missed before, and maybe he was finally seeing the shift that had already taken place. The version of me that was no longer waiting for his response, his defense, his approval. "Emily," he said again, softer now, "what happens next?" And it was not a question about logistics. Not really. It was a question about direction, about what remained when something fundamental had changed. And I did not answer right away, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to say it in a way that was clear, not emotional, not reactive, just true. "What happens next is simple," I said. "We move forward based on what is real, not what we expected." And he stayed quiet after that, his eyes searching mine for something more, something he could hold on to, but there was nothing else to give. Not in that moment, not in the way he wanted, because what had changed tonight was not just the structure of assets or control. It was the understanding between us, the recognition of what had been missing long before any document was signed. He nodded slowly, almost to himself, like he was processing it piece by piece, and then he said, "I did not think it would go this far," and I could hear the honesty in that, the lack of awareness that had carried him to this point, and I answered without hesitation, "It went this far a long time ago. We just did not say it out loud," and that seemed to settle something in him, not resolve it, not fix it, but clarify it. And sometimes clarity is more final than resolution. The door behind him opened again, and I saw Margaret step out onto the pavement, her posture still composed, her presence still controlled. But there was a difference now, not in how she held herself, but in how she looked at me, no longer dismissive, no longer certain, but attentive, deliberate, like she was seeing me in a way she had not allowed herself to before. She stopped a few feet behind Daniel, not interrupting, not inserting herself immediately, just observing, and I recognized that too, the shift from dominance to strategy, from assumption to calculation. "This is not finished," she said after a moment, her voice calm, steady, but carrying a different weight now, and I met her gaze without hesitation. "I know," I said, and that was enough, because we both understood what that meant. Not conflict in the way she might have expected, but continuation, consequence, the unfolding of something that had already been set in motion. Daniel glanced between us again, his expression still unsettled, but quieter now, less reactive, more aware, and I realized that whatever came next would not happen in a single moment, not in a single conversation. It would unfold over time, through decisions, through actions, through the reality that had been established tonight. I adjusted my grip on the folder again, feeling the solid weight of it in my hand, and I took a small step back, creating just enough distance to signal that this conversation, at least for now, had reached its natural end. "I will have my attorney follow up with yours in the morning," I said, keeping my tone even, professional, because that was where this had moved, beyond personal, beyond emotional, into something structured, something defined. Margaret nodded once, a small, controlled acknowledgement, and Daniel did not speak. He just watched me, like he was trying to memorize something before it changed again, and I gave him one last look, not filled with anger, not filled with regret, just recognition of what had been, and what would not be the same again. Then I turned, stepping away from both of them, from the building, from the version of the night that had begun with expectation and ended with clarity, and as I walked toward the quiet street beyond the lights, I felt something settle inside me, not relief, not triumph, just certainty, the kind that does not need to be announced, the kind that simply exists once the truth is no longer hidden. The drive away from the venue felt longer than it should have, even though the streets were familiar and the distance was not far, and I realized it was not the road that had changed, it was the weight of everything that had just happened settling into place. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, steady, controlled, but I could still feel the echo of the evening in the small details, the silence in the car, the absence of voices, the way my mind replayed certain moments, not as questions, but as confirmations. Daniel not speaking, Margaret's expression shifting, the room going quiet, and none of it felt chaotic anymore. None of it felt overwhelming. It felt clear, like pieces that had finally aligned into something I could no longer ignore or reinterpret. I stopped at a red light a few blocks from the venue, the soft glow of the signal reflecting across the windshield, and for a moment, I just sat there, not moving, not thinking ahead, just allowing the stillness to exist without interruption. And it was in that quiet pause that I realized something I had not fully understood before. I was not carrying the weight of what I had done. I was carrying the absence of what I no longer needed to hold, the constant adjustment, the careful words, the effort to fit into a space that had never truly opened for me. And that absence felt lighter than anything I had expected. When the light turned green, I moved forward again, the car gliding through the empty street, and I did not rush. I did not feel the need to get anywhere quickly, because there was no urgency left, only direction. When I reached my apartment building, I parked slowly, turning off the engine and sitting for a second before stepping out. The night air was cooler now, quiet in a way that felt steady, not empty. And I walked inside, the familiar hallway, the soft lighting, the sound of my footsteps against the floor. Everything felt the same and completely different at the same time, like I had stepped back into a space I knew, but as a version of myself that had changed. I set the folder down on the small table near the door, not carefully, not ceremonially, just placing it there like any other object, because it no longer needed to be held with significance. It had already done what it needed to do. I moved through the apartment slowly, taking off my shoes, setting my keys down, small actions that felt grounding, simple, real. And I paused near the window, looking out at the city lights in the distance, the quiet hum of life continuing outside, and for the first time since the evening began, I allowed myself to breathe without holding anything back, not tension, not expectation, just a steady, even breath that settled into me naturally. My phone buzzed lightly on the table behind me, and I did not need to look to know who it was, but I turned anyway, picking it up and glancing at the screen. Daniel's name, a single message, "Can we talk?" And I stared at it for a second, not reacting immediately, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be certain of what I felt before responding. And what I felt was not anger, not resentment, just clarity, the kind that makes decisions simple. I placed the phone back down without replying, not as avoidance, but as choice, because some conversations need space before they can happen honestly, and this was one of them. I walked into the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, the sound of it filling the glass quiet and steady, and I took a sip, letting the simplicity of the moment ground me again. No noise, no pressure, no expectation, just the present. And I realized that this was the first time in a long time that I was not anticipating someone else's reaction, not preparing for a response, not adjusting my own behavior to fit a dynamic that no longer existed. I was simply there, in my own space, on my own terms, and that realization did not feel dramatic. It felt calm, almost quiet in its certainty. I walked back to the living room, sitting down slowly, my eyes drifting back to the folder on the table, and for a moment, I considered everything that had led to that point. The conversations, the small signs, the moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but had built into something undeniable. And I understood now that this had not been one decision, not one moment. It had been a series of realizations, each one bringing me closer to the point where I could no longer ignore what was in front of me. My phone buzzed again, another message, this time from an unknown number, and I hesitated for a second before checking it. The message was short, professional, confirming that all documents had been processed and finalized, that everything was in effect as of that evening, and I read it once, then again, not because I doubted it, but because seeing it written made it feel complete in a different way. Not just an action, but a fact, something established, something that would not shift with conversation or opinion. I set the phone down again, leaning back slightly, and I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to let everything settle fully, to allow the quiet to hold without interruption. And when I opened them again, I felt the same clarity, the same steady sense of direction, not something I needed to chase, just something that was already there. And I realized that whatever came next, whatever conversations would happen, whatever reactions would follow, they would not define me in the same way they once did, because that had already changed. Not in the room, not in front of everyone, but here, in this quiet space, where I no longer needed to question where I stood. In the weeks that followed that night, nothing returned to what it used to be, and for the first time, that did not feel like a loss. It felt like clarity. My days became quieter, not empty, but intentional. I no longer woke up thinking about how to adjust myself to fit someone else's expectations. I no longer replayed conversations in my head wondering what I should have said differently. Instead, I moved through my routine with a sense of steadiness that I had not felt in a long time. Mornings were simple, coffee by the window, the soft light coming through the glass, the city waking up at its own pace, and I realized that peace does not arrive all at once. It builds slowly, in small moments where you finally stop questioning your own worth. Daniel and I did speak again, not immediately, not in the emotional aftermath of that night, but days later, in a quiet office, across a table that felt very different from the one at the wedding. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just a calm conversation about what had happened and what it meant moving forward. And for the first time, I saw him clearly, not as the person I had hoped he would be, but as the person he had shown himself to be, and that difference mattered. Because love, I learned, is not built on what someone could be. It is built on what they choose to do when it matters most. And sometimes, the hardest truth to accept is that silence can be a decision, just as much as words can be. We parted ways without drama, without anger, just an understanding that what we had was not enough to carry us forward, and that realization, as difficult as it was, also felt honest. Margaret, on the other hand, did not disappear from my life entirely, but her presence changed. The distance between us became defined, structured, no longer blurred by expectation or obligation. There were conversations through attorneys, formal, controlled, and in those interactions, I noticed something that I had not seen before. Not respect in the way people often describe it, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes they can no longer define you on their own terms, and that was enough. Because I was no longer looking for approval, I was simply standing in my own position, and that made all the difference. Over time, I began to understand something deeper about everything that had happened, something that went beyond that one night, beyond the documents, beyond the words that were said or not said. It was about boundaries, not the loud kind, not the kind that needs to be announced, but the quiet ones, the ones you set for yourself when you decide what you will accept and what you will not. And I realized that for a long time, I had been crossing my own boundaries just to keep the peace, just to avoid conflict, just to belong. But belonging should never come at the cost of losing yourself, and that was the lesson I carried with me, not as a regret, but as a turning point, something that reshaped how I moved through the world. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt small in a room where you were supposed to feel valued, If you have ever stayed silent because you thought speaking up would cost you something important, I want you to know this. Your silence should never be the price of someone else's comfort. Your worth is not defined by how well you fit into someone else's expectations. And the moment you start trusting your own instincts, the moment you stop ignoring that quiet voice inside you that says something is not right, that is the moment everything begins to change. Not all at once, not perfectly, but steadily. And sometimes that quiet shift is more powerful than anything else. There were nights after that where I questioned everything, where I wondered if I had been too harsh, too distant, too final. And in those moments, I learned to sit with those thoughts without letting them take control. Because growth is not about never doubting yourself. It is about knowing when your doubt is coming from fear and when it is coming from truth. And learning to tell the difference takes time, takes patience, takes honesty. I also learned to protect not just my emotions, but my independence, my decisions, my future. Because love should never require you to give up your ability to stand on your own. It should support it, strengthen it, and if it does not, then it is not the kind of love that will carry you forward. And maybe that is the most important thing I can share with you. Do not wait for someone else to define your value. Do not wait for a moment of public recognition to prove your worth. Know it quietly, consistently, in the way you choose yourself even when no one else is watching, because that is where real strength comes from. I believe, in my own way, that there is something greater guiding us, whether you call it faith, intuition, or simply a deeper awareness. There are moments when something inside you knows before your mind catches up, and learning to trust that, to listen to it without fear, is one of the most powerful things you can do for yourself. So, if you have ever felt like you are standing in the wrong place, like you are being seen in a way that does not reflect who you truly are, take a step back, breathe, and remember that you are allowed to choose a different path, one that aligns with your truth, not someone else's expectations. Thank you for listening to my story, truly, because sharing something like this is not about reliving the past, it is about finding meaning in it. And if even one part of this made you feel understood, made you feel less alone in something you are going through, then that means more than I can fully express. You are not alone, even when it feels like you are. There are people who understand, who have been there, who have made difficult choices and found their way through them. And if this story resonated with you, you can share where you are watching from or what time it is in your city, just a small way to connect. And if you want to hear more stories like this, you can stay with me here. Because sometimes hearing someone else's truth helps you see your own more clearly. My name is Emily Carter. I am 29 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is simple. Never let anyone else define your worth when you already know who you are.